Delegate Eleanor Holmes Norton has announced she will donate a day's pay for each day federal employees are furloughed this year as a result of sequestration. She is our first guest today, and thank you as always for coming in and talking with us.
It's a pleasure.
First, we got to talk about, there's so much with this, but your efforts in this. What made you decide that you, in fact, were going to be donating a day of pay for each of these furloughs?
Well, what your listeners may not know is that members of Congress are protected by the Constitution from having their pay cut during the term in which they are serving. So here you have members, needlessly I must say, visiting cuts on federal employees, on the public, and on the economy when they are completely immune and exempt from these cuts. What I've done is a simple gesture. It doesn't begin to be the kind of sacrifice, because for me it is no sacrifice, that federal workers have taken. Remember, they're going into their third year of a freeze. The Republicans rushed to the floor for yet a third year of the freeze, and that's before we even got to the sequester and the cuts for everybody else. Then you have sequester, uncertainty on top of uncertainty. And if you follow what the agencies are saying, there's no question that there will be some furlough days. If this goes on, for example, let's take public safety. Border Patrol says that they will definitely have 14 days of non-consecutive furlough days for all their employees if this goes on. And think about the public. There's a lot of hay being made about the fact that the sky didn't fall on Friday.
Right, yeah.
When sequester began. That's really not how it works. The way it works is that the government cuts across the board, not at one fell swoop, but after a cumulative amount is cut is when you will begin to feel it. And a perfect example of that is that you've got to give 30 days notice before an employee can be furloughed.
Right.
So before there are all kinds of cuts being made now as I speak, but they don't involve employees. In fact, what employees are having to do is to envision that they will be furloughed and they'll pile up on work so that the work can continue and the public can be served. This is, you know, when you think about how needless all of our cliffs were, this is the most needless, because it seems to be deliberate. In the beginning, because it was never meant as anything but the prod to get us to come up with a solution. This was not a solution, just the prod. In the beginning, both sides were concerned. Republicans were particularly concerned about cuts in defense, so much so that some went to the floor to try to pull back the defense cuts. Then it became clear that you're dealing with a president who is listening to the Fed, who is listening to virtually every economist, and they say that, yes, you should draw down the deficit now in doses, but you've got a slowly recovering economy, and therefore you've got to have some revenue or else you will go back into recession. So the president comes back and says, I will go along with cuts, but I don't want to get us back into recession or anything close to it, and I don't want to happen what the Fed chief says will happen, and he says that you'll lose a half a point off of growth, and growth is only about 2% as it is. So let's have some balance here. And the Republicans, who are essentially controlled by the Tea Party, control Republicans in the House, not because they have so much power as individuals, but collectively there are a large number of them. And when they say we're never going along with revenue, then it becomes a strategy.
Right.
If the only way to get cuts only is through the sequester, let her roll. Who cares what happens to federal employees or even to the economy or public services? This way you will get some cuts. And you will get a new baseline. That is to say, when it's all over, any more cuts will proceed from where you left off. So you're better off than if the cuts proceeded from today, where the baseline is higher. and therefore you'd be left with more revenue in the federal government. It is so absurd that you don't almost have to be in an asylum to come up with it. That's what you've got. The inmates are in charge of the asylum, otherwise known as the House of Representatives.
I was going to say, well, you were there in the thick of it, so certainly you would know the tone and the feeling from it. A lot of people, you touched on this, the uncertainty and saying, you know, well, we didn't hit the fan Friday when this all sort of started, but what is going to happen moving forward? And some people take the thought process over the weekend of hearing people talk of, well, nothing happened. This went into effect and nothing happened. It didn't affect me. It didn't affect my neighbor. So what? Other people saying, give this a couple weeks and the uncertainty of what will happen and then watch to see. What do you say to constituents in the district of, you know, who are both on those sides of the fence of, well, this hasn't directly impacted me and I don't work for the federal government, or others saying, a few weeks from now, things could be a lot different?
Well, let's take the only experience we've had. We know what happens when there's a shutdown. And so people expect when there's a crisis, you ought to feel it the way you do when there's a shutdown of the federal government. And you will notice that although the Republicans shut the government down more than once in the 1990s, they're quick now to say they won't shut it down again because there was such a backlash from the public. So if you don't have a shutdown, but you simply shave incrementally off of the federal budget day by day, you will get to a point when everybody simply has to feel it. And the reason you have to feel it is not that there's 2% or so in cuts. We might get there anyway.
Right.
The problem is it's front-loaded. And that's the danger to the economy. If you do sudden cuts, that's like a recession, pushing you straight down. If you take these cuts and spread them over, you won't have the same effect. So we don't want cuts essentially to take place, and we may be left with putting the rest of them in no more than 6 or 7 months' time when this is all over.
Right.
You don't want front-loaded cuts. You want the cuts to come evenly, and you don't want to, yes, the public should be afraid, but not afraid because of tomorrow, but afraid enough to say, stop it now. Stop it before it gets to the point where we can feel it.
You talked about the other deadline of March 27th and the possibility of a government shutdown. It seems we're always on benchmarks of reaching certain deadlines when it comes to Capitol Hill, and we're drawing near to another one. But we have heard a lot of people say on the Hill, we're not going to get to that point. What has happened here with the sequester is different and will not impact the decisions that are made. You all have a House vote coming up later this week to talk about funding and a measure for that. What do you expect to happen, and do you think there'll be movement soon, or do you think, as we have seen in the past, we'll get right up to that deadline before something is done?
Well, what could happen, given the insanity, if you wanted to shift to sanity, you take the congressional resolution you just spoke of, which comes up on the 27th. We're going to be voting on that. You take it, you see as far as you've gotten with the sequester, you'd roll those cuts into the congressional resolution, and we'd be over with it. And by the way, the cliffs will continue because I believe it is May 19th. There's another debt ceiling.
Yes.
So I mean, if this is any way to run a business, much less a government, I haven't heard anyone say they like it this way. But I do believe that the administration was right. They weren't saying that the cuts are going to be catastrophic immediately. They were saying, and they had an obligation to say, what would happen if these cuts went on over a period of time. Now, what I am afraid of in the short run is the effect of the cuts on the economy. Federal employees, for example, are scattered throughout the United States.
Right.
Their disposable income, what they give in revenue and taxes. I'm afraid about how individual jurisdictions will feel this. For example, I certainly am afraid how this region will feel it,
right,
with its disproportionate number of federal employees and federal contractors. We already saw one major contractor say he lost he lost money in the last quarter. We are a region where even the private sector is tied, absolutely tied to the public sector. It may also have revenue from around the country, but you wouldn't have a private sector here if it were not for the federal government. So the reason that the public doesn't know what to expect, and since it hasn't felt the worst